The story is told of a young girl who was retrieving a toy from under her bed, and she became fascinated by a good-sized dust ball that was rolling around under the bed. She went to her mother and she asked, "Mom, is it true what they taught us in religious school, that we are made of dust and that we return to dust?" Her mother replied, "Yes, it's true." Then she said, "Well, there is somebody under my bed, and I don't know if they're coming or going." That points to a potential tragedy in life. How sad it is when we cannot tell whether we're coming or going, where we are along the path of life. Are we growing or are we going? And what has life taught us along the way? Today is Yom Kippur. We fast. Some of us wear a white shroud called a kittel. We refrain from leather. Similar, the white is similar to the tachrichin, the burial shroud that traditionally Jews are buried in by the Chevra Kadisha. And in a few moments from now, we will pause to remember the precious lives that touched our lives in this world. And we'll come to understand that life is a fleeting, precious gift, not to be squandered and not to ever be taken for granted. In short, Yizkor is a time to remember who we are, where we came from, and take to heart the lessons from the lives of those no longer with us today. 50 years ago today, I was in shul on Yom Kippur as a 14-year-old boy. My dad, Shalom, was on the pulpit. He was a rabbi as well, leading services. And on the bima, suddenly, the service that day came to a dead, abrupt stop. Over 1,000 people fell totally silent. Word had reached somebody in shul, and they went up to the bima to inform my dad that a major war had just broken out on the holiest day of the year, and Israel was under a devastating surprise attack. So 50 years ago today was in fact that Yom Kippur War. And to underscore how short 50 years really is, next year, as Dan announced, we're going to be celebrating the 50th anniversary of Beth Shalom. Only a few months after the devastating Yom Kippur War, our shul congregation Beth Shalom was born. And starting next year, you'll hear more about our plans as we celebrate this important milestone. The important point is that 50 years ago isn't really that long. People don't realize how devastating that attack was to Israel, its psyche 50 years ago, how close Israel actually came to defeat at that war. Syria began its attack with 100 aircraft, 655 artillery pieces. The Egyptian army was even larger. In the north, the Israel Defense Forces were woefully outmatched by the Syrians, who had many, many more tanks, and they actually were able to deny Israel aircraft superiority. If you get a chance while it's still out, go see the movie Golda, because it is about that time period and is really an interesting look on the inside of Israel's decision makers at that fateful time. One of the incredible stories that came out of that war was how under attack, the 77th Armored Battalion commander, Avigdor Kachalani, was down to just 7 tanks as he faced Syria's rapidly approaching fresh 3rd Army Division. Kachalani drove up the hill alone, which is a commander's worst nightmare. At that point, he recalls, "I saw 150 or 160 enemy tanks racing towards me. I decided to attack. I gave the order, but nobody moved. I gave the order again, and nobody moved. I told my men, we are Jews, we have no choice. And when I started moving, thankfully, I saw some other tanks moving. God somehow let me reach the hill that day before the mass of Syrian tanks got there, because otherwise they would have easily slaughtered us. A friend of mine in Israel, some of you have been on tours with him, Asher Ashkenazi was our madrich, also the main reason I think we bought our place in Modi'in in Israel, because he lives in nearby Reut, which got me looking at this area and all the cranes and saying, my goodness, what are they building here? Now the fourth largest city in Israel. And he tells the story to tour groups often at the banks of the Jordan River. Syrian tanks had burst through right to that point, through the Golan, and they stopped at the Jordan River, prepared easily at this point to cut the country in two. For some reason, they stopped. They did not cross the river. Nobody really knows for sure what happened, but one possibility, as Asher said, was that Golda Meir sent a message to the United States through Henry Kissinger, also figuring in that movie Golda, and she said to him, if one tank crosses the Jordan River, we're going to have no choice but to call up Dimona and prepare to use the ultimate weapon, which had really just been developed just a few years before. That was 50 years ago. Now I want to take you just 30 years before that. It was 1943. Jews were being transported to death camps in unfathomable numbers. Over 6,000 people, men, women, and children, killed day after day after day, never to be heard from again. Some were relatives of many of you who are here in Shul today. The death and destruction of European Jewry at the hands of the Nazis, 6 million represented 2/3 of European Jewry. Poland was one of the largest centers of Jewish life, totally wiped out in a way not seen since the Crusades. So why do we still tell the stories? Why do we still produce movies about the Holocaust so many years later? Isn't it enough already with the Holocaust? Well, in a documented account of the fate which befell 1.2 million children during the Holocaust were these few sentences. Listen to these few lines. Then the guard ordered the children to fold their clothes and march into the gas chamber and the crematory. One little boy, less than 2 years of age, was too little to climb the steps. So the guard took the child in her arms and carried him into the gas chamber. So right there is the reason we still tell the stories, the reason we still remember. One little boy, I was actually looking through my dad's old files, and I found that in a sermon given 60 years ago by Rabbi Saul Teplitz. He recalled that story and he wrote, 6 million Jews is an incomprehensible figure. The lips can say it in a moment, the mind cannot absorb it in a lifetime. 1.2 million children under the age of 16. The figure is staggering, but it still says nothing to the heart. One little boy, too little to climb the steps into the gas chamber. That breathes the agony of life and the anguish of death, and then we understand. So how would the Jewish people ever bounce back from a tragedy of that magnitude? Would we ever recover? Then, before we had a chance to process what had happened, Israel became a sovereign state. But would this fledgling nation even manage to survive? For many Jews during the Holocaust, life or death really came down to a little piece of paper. And I was reading something I was going to share in Martyrology, but I loved this paragraph. He said, the burden of being Jewish is to live all of Jewish history. He says, "I see no difference between the victims of Auschwitz and the victims of the War of Independence that I dealt with. They are all casualties of Jewishness and Jewish history. What difference can there truly be?" Point. So, for many Jews during the Holocaust, it came down to just luck if you survived. A piece of paper, visa, transit papers. This past 2023, Adolfo Kaminsky died at the age of 97 years old. Don't know if you've heard the name. His forgeries saved thousands of Jews. His talent for creating realistic documents helped children, their parents, and others escape deportation to concentration camps, death camps, and in many cases to flee Nazi-occupied territory. His talent was as banal as could be. He knew how to remove supposedly indelible blue ink from paper. It was a skill that he developed that helped save thousands of Jews in France during World War II. So how did he learn this kind of crazy little talent? Because as a teenager, he used to work for a dry cleaner in his Normandy town. And when he joined the anti-Nazi resistance at 18 years of age, his expertise enabled him to erase the Jewish-sounding names like Avraham or Moshe that were inscribed on the French ID cards and the food ration cards, and he would substitute them with Gentile-sounding names. It's these little unusual coincidences that saved many people that otherwise would have been sentenced to death and perished like everybody else. So let me quote the movie The Matrix for my fellow sci-fi buffs. Morpheus, when he's trapped by the machines. Actually, no, this was a different part in the movie, but you'll know what I'm talking about. He said these words, "History, it would seem, is not without a sense of irony." So you want to hear something profoundly ironic? 4 months ago, June of this year, the German government decided to pay Israel $4 billion to purchase its Arrow 3 missiles to intercept ballistic missiles. I want you to understand what that means. The Jewish state, the state of the people that in earlier Germany tried to annihilate, just asked Israel to help protect the German people from a possible nuclear attack, a generation after the final solution to the Jewish problem. So that's part of what it means to be alive right now, during a time when there is a strong Jewish state. And for Jews in places like France, where anti-Semitism continues to surge, it means that Jews have a safe place to go when they feel threatened. It means that our survival as a people doesn't rely on a particularly happenstance or who's running a particular country at a time and wondering when anti-Semitism will make Jewish life intolerable for you in the place where you happen to live. But perhaps the more central question we should ask ourselves today is this: why does it really matter if we survive as a people or not? Can't the world get along just fine if there's no Jews in it? Why does proclaiming Am Yisrael Chai, the Jewish people live, matter? And that's a personal question that many of you will ask different ways. But if we survive, if we manage despite all of the efforts to squash us, it means that our Jewish identity, our music, our faith, our ethics, our millennia of writings, the Talmud, our cultural values, the essence of who we are as a people, it'll continue to survive as well. The Jewish people have brought a great deal into the world. Over 210 Nobel Prizes, medical advancement, discoveries of every kind, and a unique way of looking at the world and respecting the dignity of every human being. We have a long and glorified tradition of being there for targeted and for disadvantaged people. That's also a big part of the Jewish heritage. I forget the Jewish comedian who said this, but he said, if a disheveled, forlorn, struggling person shows up at our doorstep looking for help, we'll do whatever we can to help that person get their life together. But if it's our own kid, we'll tell them to get their lazy behind out the door and do something with their life. So among the gifts that our people have brought to the world, the Jewish people invented this idea of Shabbat. Talked a little bit about last night. We promoted the idea that life should not be a never-ending struggle to make a living and accumulate stuff. One day a week, we need to take a break from the mundane and pause to reflect what's important in life and be there with our loved ones, our family, our shul, our community. Am Yisrael Chai, the people of Israel live, also means that we have a special bond. Even when we don't disagree, even when we disagree with one another, and even when we don't like each other very much. We are bound together as a people, and we actually depend on one another. If that's anything that history has taught us, it is that lesson. So at Yizkor time, I'm hoping we'll really remember that sacred, special bond that we have with fellow Jews everywhere. Remember Evan Gershkovich. He's the Wall Street Journal reporter arrested in Russia back in March on made-up charges of espionage. And here's an example of that special bond that the Jewish people have with one another. So far, nearly 3,000 Rosh Hashanah messages from 21 countries were sent as part of the Shana Tova Evan campaign. By the way, Anatoly Sharansky said while he was a refusnik that the only reason he thinks he wasn't killed was because of all of the attention that was being paid to him in American Jewish communities, Western media. That put a focus on him, so it wasn't so easy for the Russians to simply make him disappear. That may be the case here. The campaign was covered in the Jewish press, the Wall Street Journal, and NPR. An op-ed in the Times of Israel this past week highlighted Gershkovich's plight, and it read, "Perhaps after so many months in prison, Evan, you might think that you risk being forgotten. Nothing could be further from the truth. Your brothers and sisters around the world, the Jewish people, are praying for you. We discuss you and your case. We tell our children and grandchildren about your bravery. We're inspired by you. For thousands of years, we're going to pray in our machzor. May God have mercy on our brethren, the entire people of Israel, who are in distress and in captivity. May God take them from darkness to light, subjugation to redemption, and we say amen." That prayer galvanizes the idea that Jews help one another when in need. It makes sure that we do all we can to never forget. Most of us, I know, don't know Evan at all, but we heard his story. We've been thinking about him while he passes the time in a Russian prison cell. Some of us set a place for him at our family seders last spring or at our Rosh Hashanah meals last week. And that's what it means when the Talmud says, Kol Yisrael Arevim Zeh Bazeh. Every Jew, everyone in Israel is responsible one for another. And Aravut is actually the slogan on the Women's League for Conservative Judaism Torah Fund pin this year, although I struggled to read that because I couldn't make out the letters. But it's very artistic, very beautiful. But that's what it's supposed to be saying. Aravut, responsibility. And that's why we remember Evan today. When we remember all of our loved ones a few moments from now, we'll remember how interconnected we all are to each other, to the generations that came before us, to all of our people scattered around the world. When you travel, we notice the mezuzahs as Jews. I always do that. In fact, in some places in Europe, you'll walk around and you'll actually see the diagonal holes where the mezuzah used to be. And believe me, those diagonal holes, you see that on a doorpost, you know how they got there. During Yizkor, consider this: the way you are living today, that is the way you will be remembered or forgotten by future generations. In an essay called Generations, Rabbi Amichai Lau Lavi, at first, he didn't realize the influence that his actions were having on his children. And he wrote the following beautiful piece. He wrote, "I inherited my father's talit, his prayer shawl, on the first day of Shiva, a few hours after we buried his body in Jerusalem. There it was, orphaned on the shelf in the living room, in its familiar blue velvet bag, with his initials embroidered in faded gold Hebrew letters. I took out the woolen fabric, the blue stripes, the worn fringes. When I wrapped it around my face, I inhaled his smell. From that day, I have been beginning each day with wrapping it around my shoulders, just as he had done each morning until his last. A daily hug from the ancestors, the weight, the love, the loss and hope of generations. I would whisper words adding to the liturgy in the Siddur, Boker Tov Abba, good morning, Father. 7 years later, my son came of age, 13. On the eve of his bar mitzvah, we went to pick up the prayer shawl that we had designed together. He had been sitting with me during the morning meditation routine all of these years, watching how I wrap and wear the talit, witnessing the words I say. On his brand new talit, my son surprised me at age 13. He secretly had those same 3 words in Hebrew embroidered, beautiful story, as a blessing to be wrapped around his shoulders. Boker Tov Abba, good morning, Father. So he writes, this rabbi, my son must have been watching me. He understood the power of actions, and he will continue the daily ritual, breathing in family blessings. We wrap ourselves in memory. We reclaim the meanings of mornings, the sadness of mourning, something that we lost, someone that we lost, and what it feels like to be alive today. So I conclude really by asking you this. Ask yourself this question. What would your child have embroidered as a blessing on their talit? What about your actions? What about your connection to Jewish people around the world? Are your family members and friends watching and learning and remembering? Are we living today the way that we want to be remembered? During Yizkor, what we all do is we invite those who are no longer with us back into our hearts and back into our memory. And we should never forget part of Am Yisrael Chai, part of the Jewish people continuing to live, is that idea that we are really eternally linked. Kol Yisrael arevim ze bazeh. The entire Jewish people are responsible for another. We reflect all their legacies that came before us. We light a Yizkor candle for our relatives. The gift of Yizkor is that sometimes by remembering, things can be seen differently, maybe even more accurately, and powerful lessons can be applied to our own lives. So Yizkor is our time to be vulnerable, to feel, to weep. The Machzor says, Yameinu ketzel over. Our days are like a passing shadow, like a breath. There is so much about life and death that we can never know, but we'll take these next few precious moments to visit with those that you have loved. Remember the world that they came from, parents, grandparents, what it means to live as a Jew today. What does it mean? What is the benefit of Am Yisrael Chai? the people of Israel live during this profound time of remembering at Yizkor. So may God continue to comfort all who mourn, and may those memories bring us healing, bring us peace, and make us never forget. Amen.